December 1944. Across the world, people believed the war was almost over. In London, newspapers rolled off the printing presses with hopeful headlines. Words like victory, freedom, and the end is near filled the front pages. Civilians smiled as they read them on cold street corners. They believed the worst was behind them. In Paris, Allied soldiers filled cafes and bars. Glasses of champagne clinked together. Laughter echoed through streets that had once known fear. Men talked about going home. About wives, children, and warm beds. Christmas was close, and many believed they would spend it in peace. In Washington, generals sat in warm offices and spoke of parades. They pointed at maps and discussed what Europe would look like after the war. Germany, they said, was broken. Its factories were bombed. Its fuel was gone. Its army was tired, starving, and beaten. The Nazi war machine, they believed, could no longer fight back. They were wrong. Far from the lights of celebration, far from the sound of laughter, there was a small room in France that felt very different. It was cold, dim, and silent. The only light came from a single lamp hanging above a massive wall map. In that room stood one man. He was not famous. He did not shout. He did not wear shiny medals or carry a pistol on his hip. He wore thick glasses and a simple uniform. His name was Colonel Oscar Call. Call stood alone, staring at the map in front of him. The map showed the entire Western Front. Every road, every river, every village. Small colored marks showed the position of Allied units and known German divisions. To most officers, it was just another map. To Call, it was a living thing. It spoke to him. And tonight it was whispering danger. Everyone else believed the war was slowing down. Call believed it was holding its breath. He slowly raised a grease pencil and traced a line along the German border. His eyes moved carefully, section by section. Then he stopped. Something was missing. Entire German armies were gone. The 6th Panzer Army, the 5th Panzer Army, elite units, tank divisions filled with hardened veterans. These were not weak forces. These were some of the most dangerous soldiers in Europe. A week ago they had been there. Now they were nowhere on the map. There were no retreat reports. No surrender messages. No signs of destruction from air attacks. They had not been crushed. They had not been captured. They had vanished. Outside Call's room, other officers spoke calmly. Some joked. Some talked about Christmas leave. They believed the silence on the German side meant defeat. They believed the enemy was pulling back, licking its wounds, trying to survive the winter. Call did not believe in easy answers. Armies, he knew, do not disappear. Not without a reason. He studied the map again. The quiet sector in the center caught his eye. The Ardennes forest. Thick trees. Narrow roads. Snow-covered hills. It was known as a safe area. American commanders used it as a resting place. They sent tired units there. New units. Young soldiers who needed experience. No one expected an attack there. That was exactly why Call was afraid. Silence to him was not peace. Silence was preparation. He moved to his desk and opened a folder. Inside were reports most officers ignored. Train movements at night. Small notes from spies. Weather forecasts. Alone each report meant little. Together they painted a terrifying picture. German supply trains were moving west, not east. Towns near the forest were being emptied. Civilians were gone. Roads were being cleared. And a massive storm was coming. Snow. Fog. Weather so bad that Allied airplanes would be useless. Call felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. If German tanks attacked under that sky, American soldiers would be blind and alone. He looked back at the map. His hand trembled slightly as he marked a large red question mark over the Ardennes. The room was silent. Too silent. In his mind, Call could already hear it. Not cheers. Not music. But artillery. Screaming steel. Trees exploding. Young men waking up in fire and blood. He checked the date again. Early December. If he was right, the attack would come soon. Very soon. He removed his glasses and rubbed his tired eyes. He had not slept well in weeks. He knew what would happen next. He would warn the others. He would show them the signs. And they would smile politely. They would say the Germans were finished. They would say he was being negative. They would say the war would be over by Christmas. Call placed his glasses back on his face and straightened his uniform. He knew the truth was heavy. And people hated heavy truths. He looked at the map one last time and spoke softly to the empty room. If I am right, he said, Christmas will come with blood. Outside, the world kept celebrating. And nobody wanted to listen. The world celebrated, but in the shadows of the Allied command, one man worked quietly. Colonel Oscar Call was not a hero in the public eye. He had no medals that gleamed under the sun, no parades in his honor, no journalists waiting for his interviews. He was invisible to most, but invisible was his power. Patton, the general everyone knew, everyone cheered for, and everyone feared, moved like a storm. He loved noise. He loved action. Tanks rolling across frozen fields. Men running at the double. Shells exploding in the distance. He carried ivory-handled revolvers, talked loudly, and demanded attention wherever he went. The public called him a hero. Soldiers called him a god of armored warfare. Call, by contrast, was quiet. His world was maps, reports, and whispered notes from spies. He did not seek glory. He did not want to be famous. His tools were grease pencils and paper stacks taller than a man. His battlefield was intelligence, observation, and deduction. While Patton chased headlines and victories, Call chased shadows. The Ardennes forest was the quiet sector that everyone ignored. Commanders sent tired men there to rest. Green recruits were sent there to learn the ropes. Officers called it safe. Soldiers called it a nursery. But Call did not trust safety in war. He had learned long ago that silence was often louder than a scream. Every morning he stood before the huge map in his dimly lit office. Every division, every movement, every patrol was marked, measured, and checked. Each tank was a piece in a puzzle, and he was the only one who tried to see the whole picture. Then came the strange disappearance. The 6th Panzer Army vanished. The 5th Panzer Army vanished. These were not ordinary units. These were Hitler's elite, veterans from the Eastern Front, killers trained in steel and fire, masters of armored warfare. One day they were fighting in the north. The next day they were gone. Radio silence. No reconnaissance sightings. Empty skies over the German border. Other generals relaxed. London reports cheered the German retreat. Soldiers wrote home that the war was ending. Everyone else saw weakness. Call saw a trap. He dug deeper. He checked the railways. Trains ran west under the cover of darkness, loaded with tanks, weapons, and fuel. German towns near the Ardennes were being evacuated. Civilians were being moved out. Why clear towns unless something big was coming? The storm forecast made it worse. Heavy snow. Thick fog. Planes grounded. Sherman tanks sitting ducks. He could almost hear the Germans laughing through the frozen forest, preparing the perfect ambush. The Ardennes was about to become a tomb for anyone foolish enough to enter blindly. Call went to his colleagues. He shared the data. Something is coming, he said. They laughed. They called him a pessimist. They pointed at Germany's ruined factories, fuel shortages, and the tired army. They can't attack, they said. It's impossible. He did not argue. He did not shout. He simply went back to his map, updated the positions, drew red question marks over the Ardennes, and whispered, "They are there. They are ready. And we are blind." Days passed. Signs increased. More trains, more evacuations, more silence. Call's warnings became urgent. He knew the storm would hide German movements. The moment of attack would come before anyone suspected. But warning someone was not enough. He needed the right person to listen. He needed someone bold, someone smart enough to trust a quiet man who stared at maps instead of crowds. That person was General Patton. Walking into Patton's office was like stepping into a thunderstorm. Patton's reputation preceded him. He yelled at officers, humiliated those who brought bad news, and moved at a pace that left men dizzy. To tell him to stop advancing into the Ardennes was madness. Many had tried. All had failed. Call approached calmly. He placed the reports on the desk. Maps showing empty areas where the Germans should have been. Train schedules showing movements west. Weather forecasts predicting fog and snow. Every detail was precise. Every calculation exact. Patton stared at the data. Silence filled the room. The staff expected him to explode. They expected yelling, fury, maybe even dismissal. But Patton did something unexpected. He listened. The loudest man on the Western Front, the general who carried pistols and demanded glory, looked at Call and asked quietly, "What do we need to do?" Call pointed to the Ardennes. He explained the trap. He outlined the risks. He described the storm and the hidden German army. He spoke softly but with conviction. He did not exaggerate. He did not plead. He simply spoke the truth. Patton walked to the window, staring at the gray winter sky. He weighed the risk. He looked at the quiet man who did not need applause. He saw not a pessimist but a truth teller. And for the first time that winter, Patton's ego stepped aside. "Do it," he said. "Prepare the counterattack. But quietly. Don't tell Eisenhower yet. He won't believe it. Just make it ready." Karl's heart beat faster. He nodded. The impossible task had begun, turning a massive army in secret, through snow and fog, ready to strike when the Germans least expected. And outside, the world continued celebrating, oblivious to the storm about to break. Because the man nobody noticed was about to save hundreds of thousands of lives. Suspense end. Backhand index pointing right, the Ardennes was about to become a battlefield, and only one man had seen it coming. The Ardennes forest was quiet. Too quiet. On the morning of December 16, 1944, a heavy fog hung over the snow-covered trees. The sun struggled to break through gray clouds, and the air smelled of frozen pine. The soldiers of the 106th Infantry Division, young Americans mostly fresh from training, huddled in foxholes, chewing on cold rations, dreaming of Christmas at home. They did not know that the Ardennes, which they had been told was safe, was about to become hell on earth. Colonel Oskar Karl had predicted this moment weeks ago. He had studied the movement of German divisions, traced every train, every truck and every radio silence. He had warned commanders, updated maps, marked red question marks across the Ardennes, and whispered that disaster was coming. Yet most ignored him. Now the disaster had arrived. Suddenly the stillness exploded. At exactly 5:30 a.m. German artillery opened fire. 1,600 guns across the forest roared in unison. The ground shook. Snow turned red as shells tore through foxholes and frozen earth. Trees snapped under the impact, throwing splinters into the air. American soldiers awoke screaming, disoriented, blinded by the firestorm. Phone lines were cut in the first minute. Command posts were buried under falling debris. Panic spread faster than the German tanks rolling from the fog. Tiger tanks, monstrous beasts of steel, emerged silently through the mist. Their 60-ton frames crushed anything in their path. Jeeps, trenches, even trees. They advanced with terrifying precision. The young Americans barely had time to aim their rifles before the first tanks rolled past. Through the chaos, Karl remained in his office. He did not panic. He simply updated his map as reports came in. His calculations were accurate. He had warned them, and now the consequences were unfolding. The Ardennes was no longer a forest, it was a trap, a killing field, and only one man had seen it coming. At Allied headquarters in Paris, generals received frantic reports. Tiger tanks in the Ardennes. Our units are surrounded. Impossible. They stared at maps that made no sense. How could German tanks appear out of nowhere? How could the safest sector be the deadliest? They had ignored the quiet man in France, and now they were paying the price. Meanwhile, in Bastogne, a small town in the heart of the Ardennes, chaos reigned. The 101st Airborne, the famous Screaming Eagles, were surrounded. Supplies were running low. Winter coats were inadequate. Ammunition was scarce. The German commander sent a long, formal letter demanding surrender, promising mercy to those who complied. General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the town, read the message. He looked at his exhausted men shivering in the snow. And he laughed. One word typed on a single page: nuts. It was defiance in the face of annihilation. It was courage forged in frostbite and fear. Karl knew Bastogne was doomed without help. And help had a name: Patton. At the 3rd Army headquarters, Patton's orders were in motion. Karl's meticulous planning had prepared the army for the impossible. Roads were scouted. Fuel was stockpiled. Maps were redrawn. Units were positioned to pivot north at a precise moment. Tanks, trucks, and artillery would move silently like shadows to strike the German flank. The problem was not strategy. The problem was weather. Snow and fog slowed every movement. Trucks slipped into ditches. Tanks skidded on ice. Men froze in open carriers. Supplies broke. Communication was difficult. The Ardennes had become a nightmare of logistics, and yet they moved forward. Patton himself was everywhere. He rode in an open jeep through freezing wind, screaming at drivers, urging artillery and infantry to keep pace. His voice carried over howling wind, his cigar smoke blending with the gray fog. Speed was everything. Every minute wasted gave the Germans a stronger grip on the trap they had set. And while Patton moved the 3rd Army, the German commanders in the Ardennes believed victory was theirs. They saw the Americans as scattered and weak, trapped like fish in a net. They did not know that the net itself was about to be cut from the outside. In Bastogne, soldiers fought desperately. Flamethrowers, machine guns, artillery, they were outnumbered and outgunned. But they held. For every foot of ground the Germans took, the paratroopers fought back. They dug foxholes in frozen ground with bare hands, patched their rifles with whatever they could find, and refused to retreat. The storm raged, the fog thickened, and the Americans struggled to survive. And still, Call's map was perfect. Every movement predicted, every danger calculated, every supply route prepared. It was like watching a chess master play several games at once while the board burned. And then, slowly, Patton's army appeared. Out of the fog, tanks and trucks emerged like a river of steel. Soldiers cheered even in exhaustion. The German advance faltered. Their flank, the one they believed was safe, was being hit from the north. The hunters became the hunted. Call stayed in his office, exhausted but calm. He watched the events unfold exactly as he had predicted. He did not cheer. He did not speak. He only marked positions on his map, silently noting which units had survived, which had fallen, and which needed reinforcement. The Ardennes was no longer just a forest. It was a battlefield, a trap that had nearly destroyed an army. And yet, thanks to a quiet man who saw what others ignored, it had not claimed total victory. The world would celebrate Patton. The press would film the tanks, the speeches, the heroism of the loudest general. But the man behind the map, the one who had foreseen the storm and warned the leaders, would remain in the shadows. One man had seen the trap, had warned the generals, and had helped save thousands of lives. But the war was far from over. The Ardennes had been a warning. The Ardennes had been a taste of what was still to come. And Colonel Oscar Call knew the next silence could be even deadlier. Suspense end. Backhand index pointing right, the Ardennes had claimed thousands, but the quiet man who saw it coming was only just beginning his work. The Ardennes had erupted into chaos. American soldiers froze in foxholes, trapped by the relentless German advance. Tiger tanks crushed everything in their path. Artillery shells tore apart the forest like lightning strikes from hell. In Bastogne, the screaming eagles, the 101st Airborne, clung to life by sheer will. Their ammunition ran low. Their winter coats were thin against the biting cold. Their hope was fading. But in the distant Third Army headquarters, a plan was taking shape, a plan that would turn despair into triumph. General Patton, the old blood and guts, moved with purpose. He had received Colonel Oscar Call's intelligence weeks earlier. The Ardennes had been marked with red question marks on Call's maps. The German assembly in the forest had been predicted, every movement traced, every route studied. And now the moment had come to act. Turning a massive army in the middle of a winter storm was no small feat. 133,000 men, thousands of tanks, artillery, and supply trucks had to pivot nearly 90 degrees, moving northward to hit the German flank. Roads were icy rivers. Fog cloaked the battlefield. Trucks toppled into ditches. Tanks skidded sideways. Men suffered frostbite, exhaustion, and hunger. Yet Patton pushed forward. Move, 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 he shouted, wind cutting through his coat, frost forming on his beard. Soldiers obeyed, knowing the speed of their advance could save thousands of lives. Every second counted. Every delay meant more American boys dying in Bastogne. Meanwhile, the Germans were confident. They believed the Ardennes was impenetrable to a counterattack. They saw their tanks advancing, their artillery crushing the American front, and they laughed. Victory was theirs, or so they thought. But they had underestimated one thing: Patton's audacity, and the intelligence of the quiet man in the shadows, Colonel Call. For days, Call had worked tirelessly in his dim office. He had tracked every German unit, calculated the exact time they would strike, and mapped every road the Third Army could use. Every supply depot, every side path, every icy trail was marked on his maps. It was a blueprint for the impossible. Now, as Patton's forces advanced, Call updated his maps with precision. He predicted where German resistance would be strongest, where tanks could be blocked, and where infantry would need support. He did not celebrate. He did not speak. He only worked. In Bastogne, the 101st Airborne fought like shadows against the storm. Flamethrowers, machine guns, and German artillery rained down, but they held. Each foxhole became a fortress. Every man became a hero. And then, in the distance, the fog parted just enough for the faint outlines of tanks to appear. Patton had arrived. The German commanders froze. Their flank, which they believed secure, was under attack. Tanks and infantry, moving with precision despite the storm, struck their positions with a force they had not anticipated. The hunters had become the hunted. Inside Bastogne, the paratroopers dared to hope. Sherman tanks rolled into town, guns blazing, clearing the way for reinforcements. Soldiers cheered, even though their faces were streaked with blood and frost. The siege was breaking. Patton did not slow down. He rode through the chaos in his open jeep, yelling orders, checking maps, and inspiring men with sheer presence. Tanks slid on ice, trucks toppled over, yet the momentum never stopped. Each mile gained was another step toward crushing the German trap. And in his office, Colonel Call continued to track every movement. He knew exactly when and where the Germans would falter. Every calculation, every prediction, every warning had been accurate. The Ardennes had been a death trap, but it had been defeated by foresight and courage. The miracle of Bastogne was complete by December 26. The town was freed. Surrounded American soldiers were rescued. German advance halted. The flank had been destroyed. Thousands of lives were saved. Yet, as the press filmed Patton, as newspapers wrote about the bold general who turned the army, no one sought Colonel Call. No cameras captured the man who had studied the maps, who had warned generals, who had worked in silence to prevent a massacre. The world celebrated the loud hero. The quiet hero remained in the shadows. Call packed his maps, cleaned his glasses, and prepared for the next intelligence report. The Ardennes had been a warning. There would be more battles, more traps, more unseen threats. And he would be ready. Patton, for all his bravado, knew the truth. In private he would say, "Without that man we would have lost the Third Army. Not because we were weak, but because we were blind." The Battle of the Bulge was far from over. The war would rage for months, with blood spilled across Europe. But the turning point, the moment when the tide began to shift, had come because one man had refused to ignore the silence. The Ardennes had been deadly, but it had also proven a truth. In war, the loudest voice does not always see the danger. Sometimes, the quiet voice, the one behind the maps and the reports, can save thousands of lives. Call would not seek fame. He would not demand recognition. He did not need parades or medals. The lives saved were reward enough. History would focus on Patton's tanks, Patton's speeches, and Patton's daring, but the real work had been done quietly, far from the cameras, in a dim office surrounded by maps. And as the snow melted and soldiers buried their dead, Call marked the Ardennes on a new map. There would be more threats, more hidden armies, and more storms. He was ready. Because the man who sees what others ignore is the one who truly changes history. The guns finally fell silent in the Ardennes. Snow began to melt, revealing the terrible cost of the Battle of the Bulge. Foxholes were empty, but their shadows remained. Trees, once proud and green, were shattered. Roads were torn apart. And the ground itself seemed to carry the screams of thousands who had died in the frozen forest. The Americans had survived, but the victory was not without pain. 19,000 soldiers lay dead, 47,000 wounded, 23,000 missing or captured. The Germans had lost even more. Over 100,000 men and almost all their tanks frozen or destroyed. The gamble Hitler had taken had failed, but the human cost was staggering. In Washington and London, the generals wrote reports. Newspapers told stories of heroism. Patton was hailed as a genius, a bold warrior who had turned the tide of the war. His tanks had crushed the German flank. His audacity had saved Bastogne. Photographers followed him. Headlines shouted his name. History seemed eager to remember the loud, the bold, the visible. But there was a quiet man far from the cameras. Colonel Oscar Call returned to his office, the maps still on the walls. The red question marks over the Ardennes had disappeared from his papers, but not from his mind. He knew the truth. Without his warnings, without his calculations, the Third Army would have been cut in half. Thousands of lives would have been lost. The Ardennes, the so-called safe sector, would have been a tomb. Call cleaned his glasses, rubbed his tired eyes, and began marking a new map. He did not celebrate. He did not write letters to the press. He had no desire for fame. Recognition was not why he had worked. The lives saved were reward enough. The soldiers who walked home to their families were proof of his success. Yet history did not notice him. When books were written, maps analyzed, and documentaries filmed, the story focused on Patton. The tanks, the speeches, the daring maneuvers. Call's existence became a footnote, a ghost in the history of the greatest battle the United States Army had ever faced. The irony was not lost on him. The man who had seen the trap, who had studied every report, every train movement, every subtle signal, was ignored. The men who had laughed at his warnings, who had called him a pessimist, were now celebrated as heroes. Call understood why. Institutions do not like to admit mistakes. Leaders do not like to face the fact that they were blind. And the truth, no matter how precise, often falls silent in the shadow of glory. Meanwhile, soldiers who had survived Bastogne told their own stories. They spoke of the freezing cold, the relentless attacks, the despair of being surrounded, and the miraculous arrival of Patton's Third Army. They whispered about the man who had predicted the German trap, about the quiet officer who had warned generals when no one else would listen. But these voices were soft, drowned by the noise of history. For Call, the war was not over. Europe was still burning. Cities lay in ruins. Millions of lives had been destroyed. But the Arden had taught him a lesson he would never forget. The loudest voice does not always see the danger. Sometimes, the quietest voice, hidden behind maps and reports, holds the key to survival. He returned to his office, preparing intelligence for the next advance. New German positions, new threats, new calculations. Every detail mattered. Every piece of information could mean life or death. And he worked as he always had, in silence. Across Europe, generals and soldiers alike began to realize the true lesson of the Arden. Victory was not just about courage or weapons. It was about listening. It was about trusting those who saw what others ignored. Patton had acted because he trusted Call. Without that trust, the Third Army would have perished. The lesson was clear but bitter. How many other warnings had been ignored in history? How many lives had been lost because someone refused to look at the maps, the details, the whispers? In the years after the war, Call faded from public life. He returned to the United States quietly. No parades awaited him. No statues, no fanfare. He lived simply, always remembering the Arden, always preparing for the battles that history did not notice. But those who served under him, who survived the cold forests and the German assault, never forgot. They remembered the man in the shadows who had saved their lives without asking for praise. And as decades passed, military historians slowly began to uncover the hidden truth. Old maps, briefing notes, and reports revealed Call's meticulous work. They discovered that the so-called intelligence failure of the Battle of the Bulge was not a failure at all. It was a failure to listen. Call had seen the storm coming. He had done his job perfectly. But the generals had doubted him, and the army had nearly paid the price. The quiet officer in the corner, the man who spoke softly while others shouted, had changed history. Without him, the Third Army would have been destroyed. Thousands of men would have died unnecessarily. Bastogne might have fallen. And the war could have ended in disaster rather than victory. The Arden was more than a battlefield. It was a lesson in humility, in trust, and in courage, the courage to listen when everyone else refused. And Colonel Oscar Call, the ghost behind the maps, remained a reminder that heroes do not always wear medals, do not always ride tanks, and do not always make headlines. Sometimes they simply see the danger no one else wants to see, and quietly stop the world from ending. The snow melted, the guns were silent, and Europe began to breathe again. Cities lay in ruins. Soldiers marched home. Flags waved over conquered towns. History began to write itself, but it was a history that preferred noise over truth. General George S. Patton became the face of victory. Newspapers printed his speeches. Newsreels followed him across Europe. Every daring maneuver, every tank that crushed the German flank, every risk he had taken under freezing skies was celebrated. To the world, Patton was a hero who had single-handedly saved the Third Army from disaster. The crowds cheered. The world applauded. Yet, in the quiet rooms of headquarters and offices far from the cameras, another story existed, one that no parade could honor. Colonel Oscar Call, the man who had seen the trap in the Arden, who had warned generals when everyone else refused to listen, had no medals. No statues. No cameras. No public recognition. Call returned to his office as if nothing had happened. Maps were still pinned to the walls. Reports were stacked in perfect order. He cleaned his glasses, adjusted his chair, and began preparing for the next day. For him, the war had not ended. There were still German movements to track, still risks to calculate, still patterns in the chaos to decode. He did not need applause. He needed accuracy. In private, Patton knew the truth. He had trusted Call's warnings. He had acted not on instinct alone, but on the intelligence provided by the quiet man in the corner. Patton's tanks moved because Call had calculated routes, weather, German positions, and timing to perfection. Without that trust, the Third Army would have been annihilated. Yet, in public, Patton received all the glory. Every historian who praised the speed, audacity, and brilliance of the Arden counterattack mentioned him. Very few mentioned the silent officer who had made it possible. Call became a ghost in history, a shadow behind every headline. For Call, that was not a tragedy. He had no desire for fame. His reward was the lives saved, the men who returned home to their families, the soldiers who would grow old because someone had refused to look away from the truth. That was enough. Still, the contrast was stark. Patton rode through towns like a conquering king, waving to crowds. Cameras captured his every gesture, his every cigar smoke moment. Meanwhile, Call walked quietly through empty offices, his maps folded under his arm. He did not smile. He did not wave. He did not ask for recognition. He worked. That was his legacy. The war continued for months. Germany's defenses crumbled. Cities fell. Concentration camps were liberated. Patton charged across the Rhine, unstoppable. He captured towns, engaged the enemy with relentless energy, and became the legend the world would remember. Kahl followed every move on the maps, every advance, every potential ambush. Even as the war neared its end, he continued to calculate, predict, and warn. Victory was not guaranteed, and in Kahl's mind, it never truly was. The Ardennes had proven that. Complacency was death. Pride was death. Only vigilance, accuracy, and truth could prevent catastrophe. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the world celebrated. Parades filled New York, London, and Washington. Patton was there, praised by generals, politicians, and journalists. He accepted accolades with confidence and charisma. Yet Kahl quietly retired from active duty, leaving the army without fanfare. He returned to a small house in the United States, living simply, away from the cameras, away from glory. In the decades that followed, military historians slowly began to uncover the hidden truths of the Ardennes. Maps were studied. Reports analyzed. The so-called intelligence failure was re-examined. They discovered that Kahl's predictions had been accurate down to the day and the mile. They found his calculations, his reports, his warnings. The Ardennes had not been a failure, it had been a listening failure. Finally, Kahl began to receive recognition, though long after the war. Young officers studied his methods in military schools. His name appeared in manuals about intelligence and strategic foresight. But the public still remembered Patton as the hero. Kahl's legacy was quieter, subtler, yet no less powerful. He was the ghost behind the legend, the mind that saw what others ignored, the man who saved thousands without ever seeking fame. Even in retirement, Kahl continued to study maps, track patterns, and analyze reports. He knew that wars were not over in the headlines. They were never over for those who understood the real cost of human life. And he understood something the world often forgot. The most important victories are not always won on the battlefield. Sometimes they are won in silence, behind a desk, with nothing but paper, pencils, and a refusal to ignore the truth. And so, as Patton's speeches were replayed in classrooms, and his daring maneuvers celebrated in history books, the quiet man behind the Ardennes remained in the shadows, unseen but undeniable. The war was over. Europe lay in ruins, but the guns had fallen silent. Cities were shattered. Soldiers returned home. Flags waved over liberated towns, and celebrations echoed across the continent. Headlines shouted victories. Parades honored generals. History wrote its story in bold letters. Georges Patton, the Lion of the Third Army, became a symbol of courage, audacity, and triumph. Everywhere he went, cameras followed. Newspapers praised his strategy, his speed, his daring. To the world, he was the hero who had turned the tide at the Ardennes, the man who had saved Bastogne, the genius of the Battle of the Bulge. Yet, behind every headline, behind every photograph, behind every speech, there was a quiet truth, a truth the world would almost forget. Colonel Oscar Kahl, the man who had predicted the German trap, who had refused to ignore the whispers in the maps, who had calculated every route, every supply line, every hidden threat, had vanished into history's shadows. No parades welcomed him. No cameras followed his every step. He had no medals, no fame, no public glory. He had saved thousands of lives and remained invisible to the world that celebrated victory. Kahl returned to a simple life in the United States. He walked quietly, observed silently, and continued to study maps and patterns long after the war had ended. To him, the Ardennes had not been an event in history, it had been a lesson. Complacency was lethal. Pride was lethal. Only truth, calculation, and the courage to see danger when no one else would mattered. Over the years, historians began to uncover his work. They discovered maps with red question marks marking enemy positions, notes detailing German supply movements, calculations predicting attacks down to the day. They realized that the Ardennes was not an intelligence failure. It was a listening failure. The Allied generals had been deaf to the warnings, and millions of lives hung in the balance. Young officers studied Kahl's methods in military schools. They learned how to analyze patterns, how to predict enemy moves, how to trust data even when it conflicted with appearances. They learned the quiet power of foresight, patience, and diligence. Kahl became a symbol, not of loud heroism but of subtle genius. The ghosts of war, the unsung heroes, the men who saved the world without ever stepping into the light. Meanwhile, the legend of Patton grew. He became immortalized in books, movies, and stories. But even Patton, the man of action and charisma, never forgot the quiet officer who had warned him when everyone else laughed. He had trusted Call's calculations. He had listened when he could have ignored. Without that trust, the Ardennes would have become a graveyard for the Third Army. The war may have ended in 1945, but the lessons of the Ardennes lived on. Leaders realized that courage alone could not win battles. Intelligence alone could not win battles. Victory required both, the daring of action and the wisdom to listen to those who saw what others ignored. Call's story is a mirror for all of us. In life we are surrounded by noise. People shout, promise, and persuade. The loudest voice is often rewarded. But the quiet voice, the one in the corner who warns of danger, who sees patterns, who refuses to look away from truth, is often the most important. The one who saves us from mistakes, who prevents disasters, who sees storms before they arrive, they are our Oscar Call. Even decades later, when the world celebrated heroes, Call remained a ghost. The files he left behind, the maps, the reports, the detailed calculations, became lessons for those who sought the truth behind the noise. History may remember the loud, the visible, the celebrated. But the real work, the work that saves lives, is often invisible. And the Ardennes, frozen and silent during the battle, whispered the story of those who had been ignored. It whispered the names of the men who had seen danger before it struck. It whispered the lessons that every leader, every soldier, every human being should remember. Listen when others refuse to. Trust when others doubt. See when others look away. Colonel Oscar Call died quietly in 1970, a man unknown to the public, a hero invisible to history. Yet his legacy was undeniable. Thousands of soldiers went home alive because he refused to ignore the truth. He had changed the course of history not with fame, not with speeches, not with bold gestures, but with careful observation, relentless calculation, and courage to speak when no one else would listen. In every war, in every battle, in every story that history chooses to remember or forget, there are ghosts, unsung heroes whose actions decide the fate of thousands. And if you listen carefully, sometimes you can hear them whispering the truth.